Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the Sci-Tech Asia Book Forum. Sci-Tech Asia is an international research network that promotes the development of science, technology, and society studies across Asia and beyond it. Today, we are here to dive into a very new book, Soda Science: Making the World Safe for Coca-Cola by Susan Greenhalgh. This is a fascinating book that explores how corporate interests influence science and public health, with a special look at what's happening in China and across America and China. I knew about this book while I was a MIT postdoc, and I visited Susan at the Fairbairn Center. I learned a lot of things from her that I never knew about the hidden secret of the food industry and about obesity and how science making is being distorted. And I also find it amusing because I used to work at one of the big foods that Susan was talking about, and I knew exactly that they have certain kind of scientists behind them trying to bring some new knowledge for people. A brief word about Professor Greenhalgh. She is the John King and Velma Cannon Fairbairn Professor of Chinese Society Emerita at Harvard University. Her interest lies in the entanglement of state, corporation, science, and society, and the consequences for human health and social justice writ large. So we are very excited to have Professor Greenhalgh here with us, along with Professor Ayo Welgeberg from the University of Copenhagen and Professor Loretta Rowe from Durham University, who will add their own unique perspectives on this important topic later. So the format today will be that Susan will give a 40 minutes, or around 40 minutes presentation, and then each of the discussants will talk about 10 to 15 minutes. And there's a space for open conversation afterward. So please jump in with your thoughts and questions as we get along. So let's make the most of this chance to think critically about this fascinating book. So thanks again for being here. Let's get started, and I will pass the stage to Susan.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yichen, for that nice introduction. And thank you, everyone, wherever you are in the world today, for coming to talk about soda science. So this book is written as a narrative, and I did that to make it accessible to as many people as possible. But that means it's very hard to summarize. So today I decided to step back from the story and then use some of the materials in the China part of the book. For the first part's about the US, the second part is about China. Use those materials to present some ideas that have been percolating in my head for quite some time. After 30 years of isolation, in 1978, China threw open its doors to the world economy. By assimilating Western science, technology, and capital, China would quickly catch up and reclaim its position as a force to contend with on the world stage. Of course, China would not accept everything Westerners wanted to bring to the middle country. In October 1985, Deng Xiaoping proclaimed, "There are those who say we should not open our windows because open windows let in flies and insects. But we say, open the windows, breathe the fresh air, and at the same time, fight the flies and insects." There was supreme confidence that the Chinese people could detect harmful influences and keep them out. But some forces in the capitalist world system turned out to be more cunning and deceitful than Deng had imagined possible. Today, I want to uncover a hidden story about capitalist craftiness. The story lies at the tragic intersection of China's worship of Western science earlier in the reform period and Western corporations' perversion of science for commercial gain. Let me start with a basic storyline. In the late 90s, as obesity began to rise rapidly in the US and around the world, American public health critics called for soda taxes and other measures to restrict the consumption of sugary soda. Facing an existential threat, the US-based soda industry, led by Coca-Cola, began quietly investing in a corporate science to protect its profits on sugary drinks, recruiting a handful of university-based scientists to do the work. By corporate science, by the way, I mean science funded by industry and created for industry benefit. This corporate science argued that more exercise, not limiting calories, was the priority solution to the obesity crisis, and that soda taxes and other regulatory measures were not needed. Although exercise is important for weight control, almost all experts believe it's secondary to dietary restriction. Scientists working with Coke claimed it was primary. So we can call this soda defense science, or simply soda science. Science created not to solve the obesity problem, but to defend the soda industry from threats to its bottom line. This soda science project originated in the US, but it was global in scope, aimed at getting soda science endorsed and built into official policies on diet-related chronic disease in major markets around the world. The key to Coke's success was an industry-funded scientific nonprofit that the food industry had created decades earlier to solve precisely such problems. Based in DC, ILSI had branches around the world, including in China. Designed to create and spread industry-friendly science, this organization had sophisticated mechanisms for spreading science to the far corners of the world through dark money channels that remained invisible to the untrained eye. Let's see. Coke's greatest success was in China, where ILSI's branch was located in the CDC, which of course is a branch of the Ministry of Health. I'll just call it the MOH. Failing to see the insect-like character of soda science, in the mid-2000s, China's scientists endorsed it as authoritative and in a secretive process built it into China's two major policies on obesity. In the mid-2010s, those policies were integrated into the larger package of policies for combating chronic disease, including Xi Jinping's signature policy package, Healthy China 2030. And so today, China's policies on chronic disease carry the fingerprints of Coca-Cola's distorted soda science of obesity. Sales of carbonated soft drinks remain high and rising, unconstrained by soda taxes. Meantime, rates of obesity and the many serious conditions associated with it, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high cholesterol, some cancers, these rates continue to soar. So Chinese policy is supposed to be made by the Chinese government. Foreign entities, especially when they intervene in Chinese politics, are deeply suspect. Ideally, they would be quickly identified as flies and insects and repelled. What happened here should be scandalous, but somehow no scandal materialized, and the corporate fingerprints on Chinese policy have remained hidden from view. So some might dismiss this as just some weird story about China. We should not. This case opens a window onto some fundamental but rarely discussed problems of China's system of governing through science. It deserves our closest attention. As professional students of China, we should be able to explain how a deliberately biased corporate science got adopted and built into Chinese policy. And yet the concepts and methods we use to study science are not adequate to the task. A rapidly growing body of work by political scientists, sociologists, economists, management specialists tells important parts of the story of China's scientific and technological advance. Underlying that work, though, is a fundamental assumption that needs questioning. Existing work assumes that Chinese science is essentially no different from the science familiar to us in Euro-America. Because it is the same, the reasoning goes, there's no need to look for distinctive features of science in the Chinese context. As a result, the science itself, who makes it, how, with what effects, remains largely a blank. Put another way, the corporate corruption of science is not legible through our analytic grids. But just as politics in the People's Republic bears the marks of China's unusual history and institutions, so too does science. Science and Technology Studies, STS, examines science as a social process that unfolds in particular social and political contexts. A fundamental tenet is that science is humanly made and bears the imprint of the institutions as well as the political, economic, and sociocultural context in which it's made. This suggests the simple but powerful point that science making in China can be expected to have some Chinese features. Of course, the same is true in every other country in the world, but today we're talking about China. So using the in-depth methods of their fields, a handful of China anthropologists and historians have brought out some distinctive features of science making in the Chinese context. 5 of these features can help us understand how apparently anomalous cases like soda science are actually not anomalous at all, but simply a product of the institutions and culture of China in the reform years. I introduce these today as working hypotheses. They need qualifying and refining, but in the interest of time, I'll state them boldly and then illustrate why they matter. So to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the scientific content is distinctive. What I'm saying is that the context is unusual, and the context shapes the process of science making in ways that may affect the content. First, science is subordinate to the party state. Since the mid-19th century, when China embraced modern science and technology to defend against the Western powers, science has been largely an instrument of state rule, introduced through top-down initiatives directed at strategic state-defined ends. Unlike in the West, where science is a relatively independent domain, at least ideally, in China, it's subordinate to party state authorities and their agendas. Far from being outside politics and objective in stance, it's inside politics and subject to the rules of the political game. Most researchers work in state-run institutions on projects designed to advance state-defined goals. To underscore the state's predominant role in science, we can call these researchers state scientists. So what about researchers in private industry, you might be wondering? In the absence of firm evidence, we can assume that industry science is also shaped by the needs of the government, although less intensely. This is an open question that needs study. In the reform decades, modern science and technology have been arguably the party's single most important vehicle for making China a rich and powerful nation and keeping the party in power. Perhaps more than in any other country, the words 科学, 技术, 科技 carry tremendous political weight. A second distinctive feature is the institution of the Chinese-style think tank. Since the early 80s, think tanks have been one of the main vehicles by which scientists who are formally outside the state bureaucracy can advise government policymakers. Advisory think tanks exist in every country, but in reform-era China, they are usually based in an agency of the government and headed by a former official with policy experience and tight guanxi connections to existing officials. And this discussion is based on the wonderful work of Zhu Shufeng, shown right here. And he's written many other articles. So they're based in government agencies and have amazing guanxi with existing officials. So 2 norms or expectations govern their behavior. First, think tanks may advise on policy, but not actually make it. That's the job of the government. Secondly, their advice should be disinterested. So a third distinctive feature is the figure of the powerful scientist official, including think tank heads who serve as de facto officials. In a system where, quote, scientific policy making, 科学决策, is politically mandatory, these figures gain authority within the government on the basis of their mastery of a specialized area of knowledge. At the same time, they enjoy the trust that inheres in the guanxi developed over many years working within the government. These close ties to government officials sometimes can allow these figures to operate with little to no oversight. This dual identity gives these figures, scientist officials, enormous personal power that they can use to advance their ideas, block rival scientists, and otherwise operate as they see fit. So fourth, scientific communities everywhere share the political culture of the wider social and political system. In China, they typically operate by means of a hierarchically structured, personalistic, Guanxi-based, leader-centric political culture, in which Chinese cultural norms of leadership and followership apply. I'll say more about those in just a minute. The scientific communities I'm familiar with tend to be hierarchically ordered in such a way that only a few state-approved officials, leaders, have a public voice. The leader articulates the truth, followers construct that truth, while dissidents are silenced and marginalized. Conflict, of course, exists, but often behind closed doors, where it's hard to hear. Finally, as STS suggests, science is shaped by cultural and political context in which it exists. Two aspects of the context were especially important in the story of soda science. First was a particular narrative about the Chinese nation, according to which a scientifically backward nation would actively learn from the West and become a great scientific power in its own right. So that may seem quaint in today's era of Chinese mastery of advanced tech, but it was and may still be the dominant narrative in some branches of public health. Second was the reform state's overarching policy of marketization, which pushed the marketization of everything, including the sciences of health and public health. What we learn depends on our methods. Science is often studied by analyzing the content of its published output, but that gives us merely the result, telling us nothing about the process by which it is made. A more promising way to see the dynamics of science and policymaking is to take seriously the STS dictum that science is actively created and advanced, and then follow the scientists in action, tracking the micropolitics by which they make science, advance it, and translate it into policy and programs. In this project, I took that approach using the classic methods of anthropology, especially ethnography, capturing actors' point of view, and what I call the deconstructionist methods of STS, that is taking apart the science to look at the hypotheses, data, etc., to see how it's made, and then innovating additional methods where needed. The specifics can be found on this slide. I'm not going to go into it, but just gathered all sorts of different kinds of data from different places and then triangulated them to produce a compelling story. So let's turn now to the case at hand. The larger question of how corporate science came to shape Chinese health policy can be broken into three separate questions that I'm going to address in the rest of the talk. First, how did a science dedicated to protecting corporate profits, not getting at the truth, get imported and endorsed? Wasn't anyone paying attention? Second, how was it built into official policy? Was there any discussion of alternatives? And third, why didn't this turn into a scandal? How could it be hidden so well that nobody raised concerns? So let's take these in turn, looking closely at the micropolitics of key actors to see how the distinctive features of science in China, mentioned a moment ago, shape the science and policy process. First, how did corporate science get imported and endorsed as authoritative? The key lay in the selection of a brilliant, well-connected scientist official to head up ILSI's China branch. Chen Chongming was one of the top nutritionists in the country. In the early 80s, she was appointed head of the chronic disease section of the Ministry of Health, and in 1983 was named president of the Chinese Academy of Preventive Medicine, the forerunner of the China CDC. In 1993, when China was reopening to the world economy after the freeze following Tiananmen, she was tapped to head ILSI's new China branch. ILSI China was not registered as a think tank, but it operated like one. And so I analyze it in those terms. As is typical for Chinese think tanks, ILSI's China branch was located in the government. In this case, in the China CDC, a technical unit, Danwei, under the Wei Shanbu. And so here's a picture of where it was. This is a CDC office in Southeast Beijing. Chen, as head of ILSI, would report to the chronic disease head of the Ministry of Health, who then reported to the Minister of Health. She was that close to the center of decision-making. So while publicly, ILSI China was a government-based scientific think tank, privately, it was an outpost of corporate science located in the core health policy institutions of the country. With ILSI's founding in 1993, Chen Chongming came to have dual loyalties, one to her country, a second to her industry benefactors, because remember, ILSI is all industry funded. So this setup would make it easy for Chen to bring corporate science into Chinese policy, allowing foreign flies and insects to buzz and swarm the space of health policy. In the late 90s, the Ministry of Health was facing problems far more pressing than chronic disease. It was more than happy to outsource the thorny issue of Manxingbing to Chen Chongming, a trusted official with decades of relevant experience and superb guanxi. In 1999 to 2003, the China branch of ILSI defined ILSI as a Chinese disease with Chinese-specific BMI, body mass index cutoff points. During these early years, with financial support quietly supplied through an ILSI member company and tight political connections to the Ministry of Health, Chen was able to seize the initiative on obesity. In doing so, she marginalized a group of Chinese experts working with the world-famous nutritionist Barry Popkin, who had spent a decade studying lifestyle and chronic disease changes in China. Popkin's based at the University of North Carolina. With her main rivals dispensed with, ILSI China became the unquestioned leader on obesity policy, more important even than the Ministry of Health, according to my informants. The dark money transfers through ILSI had allowed ILSI China to take charge of the obesity issue. So with obesity firmly established as an official disease in China, around 2004, China moved to the next stage of developing public health strategies to stop obesity from rising. This is when soda science, with its emphasis on exercise, began to take root in China. With the assistance of ILSI headquarters in Washington, ILSI China organized a series of international conferences on obesity to bring, quote, the best of international science to China. Those introduced as the best internationally were none other than the American scientists who had worked with Coke and ILSI in the US to create the soda science promoting exercise first. These conferences, then, were not places for debates between competing positions. Instead, they were sites for the presentation of corporate science, where Chen dominated the agenda, delivered the food industry's soda science to China, and ensured it was endorsed as the best science for the country. I attended a major conference in late 2013. In the book, I describe how it was organized, with foreign scientists prioritized over Chinese, and how the soda scientists from the US promoted almost exclusively exercise solutions, while claiming to care about diet too. Sorry. There we go. By the way, I'm not suggesting that Chen Chongming knew that the science she was bringing was biased by corporate interest. I don't think she knew. If she thought hard about it, she might realize, but I really don't think she knew. But she knew she was working with companies, and companies always have their own agendas. Okay, the science transferred to China through ILSI produced a marked shift in China's approach to obesity, aligning it with the interests of Coke. Between 2019 and 2015, the proportion of official anti-obesity activities emphasizing exercise rose dramatically from 0 to 60%, while the proportion emphasizing nutritional solutions fell in half from about 40 to 20%. The solutions advocated by Soda Science, exercise first, soda tax never, had been endorsed as China's approach to the condition. In many national contexts, the prominence of foreign industry in making health policy would have raised concerns. In China, though, two features of the political, economic, and cultural context made it all seem natural and even unquestionable. First, Chinese researchers viewed the introduction of obesity science from the US through that national narrative, highlighting the backwardness of Chinese science and the need to actively learn from the advanced West, especially the US. Second was the government's policy of marketization. In health policy, the government called for using market-based actors, funds, and market-based solutions to the problems of worsening health that came with rapid socioeconomic development. The state's enthusiasm for market solutions was replicated in the community of public health specialists I talked to. No one questioned why foreign food companies were sitting at the policy table, funding conferences and speaking at the conferences. Quote, everyone has to get money from the market, unquote, one informant told me. She was actually a professor of philosophy. While all agreed about the benefits of corporate health promotion, there was virtually no concern about the risks, including the possibility the industry might be prioritizing its own profits over the health of Chinese people. So these two sets of dynamics seem to have kept questions of industry influence away. Turning to the second question, how did corporate science come to be translated into Chinese policy? To get to the bottom of this, we need to consider the workings of China's political culture. As head of a Chinese-style think tank, Chen operated as a de facto Chinese policymaker. In the first decade of the century, she created China's two most important policies on obesity: the official guidelines on its prevention and control, shown on your left, and the healthy lifestyle for all action on your right. What enabled her to dominate the process was her extraordinary guanxi. According to, is that right? Yeah, according to my informants, especially Western informants, she had connections high up in the central government. When problems arose, the solution was but a phone call away. She also had personal attributes of a leader. At the same time, though, she was an agent of corporate science, whose job was to ensure that the interests of ILSI's funding companies would be taken care of in China's policies. So in China, the process of making national or central level policy tends to be a closely held secret. Policymaking on sensitive issues bearing on party legitimacy is confined to inner circles of the party and government. But at least at certain times, policymaking on so-called technical issues like health, environment, and Sci-Tech policy has been more open to experts outside the bureaucracy. The making of chronic disease policy during the Hu and early Xi Jinping eras was very different. In this case, one person outside the government, Chen Chongming, orchestrated everything from beginning to end and kept it all secret. As she explained it to me, the official obesity guidelines were the product of a bottom-up, highly personal dynamic in which she first persuaded the ministry that the obesity problem was serious and China needed guidelines. The ministry then asked ILSI to provide them. ILSI quickly drafted them, sent them to experts for comment, revised them, and then presented them to the government for review. After a few more back and forth, they were accepted and published as a standard ministry document. All evidence of ILSI's involvement removed. The process for creating that national healthy lifestyle action, which is still carried out every year, was identical. So as a result of this informal Guanxi-based leader-centric political process, the policy preferences of Coca-Cola and its corporate friends, exercise first, soda tax never, were built into Chinese policies. So think tanks were not supposed to let this happen. They were expected to provide neutral policy advice and to only advise, not actually make policy. In bringing corporate influence into Chinese health policy, Qin deviated from both these norms. ILSI China's advice was not neutral, but tilted toward industry interests, and the organization moved beyond advising into actual policy making. But both deviations remained invisible. A brilliant political actor, Chen made strategic use of two discourses in ways that veiled the reality. And made those deviations disappear. First, she stated again and again and again that ILSI engages in only policy recommending, not making. And her second rhetorical practice was to associate her organization with the magic word science, linking ILSI China to the government and its core project. Chen constantly stressed the scientific, non-commercial nature of all of ILSI's activities and recommendations, saying nothing about their possible bias due to ILSI's corporate funding. All the materials they use, the little BMI chart, everything was plastered with the word science, modern science. So the political weight of science, which was heralded by the government as the essential key to China's global rise, helped shield ILSI's work from scrutiny. Attaching the politically celebrated word science to everything her organization did signaled ILSI's adherence to the government's core agenda, serving as a kind of political performance, a biaoxian, that provided ongoing protection against charges of corporate bias. So then how was corporate science built into Chinese policy? The short answer is that Chen's position at ILSI basically demanded it, and because of her remarkable Guanxi, no one questioned her. And to make sure questions didn't arise, she made strategic use of ongoing discourses or language to stress the positive contribution of ILSI's work. So in creating Chinese policy with Coke funding and ideas, ILSI China was taking big risks and courting scandal, but no scandal ever emerged. To understand why, our third question, we need to consider the complex terrain of science ethics. To be considered good or credible, science must be, or be perceived to be, neutral, unaffected by political and economic interests. On that, everyone I talked to wholeheartedly agreed. But what happens when reliance on corporate funding makes neutrality impossible? Since the early 2000s, the science bureaucracies of the Chinese government have grappled again and again with problems of scientific misconduct, establishing rules, oversight committees, and so on. Yet one kind of ethical problem, conflicts of interest in the industry funding of science and the warping of knowledge and policy that often results, has escaped oversight. When I began cautiously asking my informants about this, I met blank stares. Susan, they said, corporate biases science is not an issue in China. The reason I believe is that the issue of corporate bias of science exposes deep contradictions between two fundamental goals of the reform state. The government promotes all-out marketization. Even science should be marketized, that is, funded by industry, turned into commercial products, and so forth. At the same time, the government encourages scientization, 科学化, the absorption and development of quality science to foster China's rise. But the two agendas often conflict. Science funded and shaped by the market is unlikely to be top quality science. The government has dealt with this contradiction by not acknowledging it. So scientists on the ground are left with an impossible bind, forced to somehow make things work on their own. This is precisely the situation that ILSI China faced. How did Chen Chongming negotiate the ethical terrain to make Ilse's China appear ethically sound, when in fact it was funded and shaped by self-interested foreign firms? Her approach was simple. She rigidly adhered to the one formal norm established by the government, which said that companies may not benefit from working with Ilse, while relegating everything that didn't fit to an informal zone of silence and secrecy. In that zone, she was protected from nosy questions by the workings of China's hierarchical political culture. That culture had norms of leadership, guiding relations with those above, and norms of followership, guiding relations with those below. The norms of leadership meant that the health ministry officials to whom she reported trusted her implicitly on the basis of longtime guanxi and policy experience. As for the norms of followership, Chen was protected by the workings of Confucian virtual ethics, in which leaders are expected to be virtuous and govern ethically. Followers, recognizing the leader's moral uprightness, are supposed to reciprocate with loyalty and obedience. In this ethical system, Chen was owed deference and respect, not questions about how she did things, especially concerning funding. In long discussions with university and CDC-based researchers working under her, I discovered that nobody had a clue about Ilse's funding arrangements. People I talked to felt they had no right to ask. Bu hao wen, they said. That's one Beida professor. Chen was a person of undeniable status, and so people trusted her to do the right thing. And even if they didn't trust her, younger researchers confided that they feared what might happen if they questioned her. So the financial secrets behind Ilse's role in corrupting China's science and policy on obesity, these secrets remain hidden from sight. A second set of ethical practices Chen followed was to create virtue narratives about, quote, the good scientist and the good multinational. The researchers I talked to saw Coca-Cola as a good corporate citizen, with generous and donating resources to China's chronic disease work and to building schools in the rural areas and all sorts of other good work for Chinese society. They admired the products of companies like Coke and Nestle, seeing them as based on the latest science. These twin narratives structured the broader discourse surrounding Ilse by conveying what should and should not be said. The result was that larger truths about China's obesity science and policy, that they were biased toward industry needs, remained unthinkable and unspeakable. The workings of China's political culture had kept a scandalous situation from coming to light. Of course, public policies on health are shaped by corporate interests everywhere, including in the US and the WHO. But China is different from Western nations in a critically important way. Unlike in the US, where a freewheeling democracy has encouraged the emergence of watchdog organizations who protest when corporate greed threatens health, in China, there are few, if any, organizations protecting the public's health from corporate greed. Civil society institutions that might have exposed the corporate influence in the past have been silenced. The government itself has long championed a market-led policy. Indeed, the state-owned enterprise COFCO, Zhongliang, has a partner with Coca-Cola to bottle and distribute the drink in China. Perhaps the financial benefits of this arrangement are blinding the government to the health costs of that fizzy drink. As a result, companies like Coke that sell sickening products and push a science that defends them are able to wield inordinate amounts of hidden influence that goes undetected. This account makes Deng Xiaoping's proud claim that China can detect the flies and insects and keep them out look a bit naive. So then, what broader conclusions or working hypotheses can we draw? Let me suggest two. This up-close look at the inner workings of science and policy making suggests that key aspects of China's institutional and cultural setup are designed to actually encourage market dominance of health policy. The corporate institutions that brought science and policy ideas to China were sophisticated global organizations. I'm talking about ILSI, highly sophisticated, brilliantly created to reshape the world to meet corporate needs. These two insights suggest that the corporate corruption of science and policy in China might be much more pervasive and consequential than we've realized, affecting not just health, but other sectors of Chinese society and economy as well. We just haven't had the concepts and methods we needed to see it. In the early 80s, the government mandated scientific policy making on the assumption that policy made with science is better policy. In the case of diet-related chronic disease, that assumption is not warranted. China's policies on chronic disease are far from best practice, as established by authorities like the WHO. According to the WHO, soda taxes are number one, a useful solution, and exercise is very much a secondary strategy. And there are other examples beyond soda science. The one-child policy, the very first policy to be made with science in the reform era. It was a terrible policy. Those who study environmental policy have reached similar conclusions about the quality of some of the policies being made. This suggests that we need to take the science created in China more seriously and to routinely include the study of science in our studies of public policy. In doing so, we need to consider not only the content of the science, but also the micropolitics of how it's made, by whom, in what context, for what purpose, and with what effects. I've laid out a few concepts and methods we can use, and there are many more. Well, thank you. I'm eager to hear the comments of our two discussants.
Okay, thank you, Susan, for this wonderful talk that encapsulated how the book and then helped us understand the science making of China. So now I will invite Professor Loretta Lowe to give us her comments. Loretta Lowe is assistant professor in anthropology at Durham University. Her research explores the intersection of ecology, health, spirituality, healing, and activism with a focus on East and Southeast Asia. So I pass the stage to Loretta.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Susan, for the presentation. I really think it captures the most kind of memorable aspects of the book. And also thanks for inviting me to discuss this timely and important book, and it's really an honor to be here today. I'll keep my commentary short, within 10 to 12 minutes. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So in Soda Science, Making the World Safe for Coca-Cola, Susan Greenhalgh unveiled how the International Life Science Institute, a non-profit organization founded by Alex Malaspina, the then vice president of Coca-Cola, creates and spreads what Greenhalgh calls soda science, a biased science of obesity designed to protect the big food industry. So the book explores how this strategy was initially developed in the United States and later exported to China, where ILSI's influence on public health policy became particularly pronounced, as we heard just now. So at first glance, this appears to be a classic story of how knowledge about diet, exercise, obesity flows from the global north to the global south, right? A narrative that has actually been problematized by anthropologists in the 1990s, who argued that nations in the global south are not merely passive recipients replicating Western models, because globalization involves complex, multi-directional flows rather than a simple one-way north to south directions. However, as I read on, I realized that while this is indeed a very successful example of how scientific discourses are decimated from a global north headquarters to a global south branch, ILSI, I don't know how to pronounce it, ILSI, China, is by no means a passive adopter of pseudoscience. In fact, the Chinese actors led by Chen Chunming, as we heard just now, played a really active and crucial role in legitimizing and translating pseudoscience into national health policy. And indeed, as Greenhalgh remarks, ILSI would not have taken root had the country not already endorsed marketizations and global integrations. So in this sense, this is not a simple story of the global North influencing the global South. So as Susan shows us just now, following Deng Xiaoping's rise to power in 1978, China embarked on a path of economic reforms that led to a rapidly growing consumer market, making China a very attractive target for industries like the soda industry. At the same time as the Chinese government shift from a state-led development to market-oriented solutions, scientists were urged to seek funding from private companies and industries. And in particular, scientists engaged in non-urgent health research, such as nutrition and chronic illnesses like obesity, had to rely on corporate funding to carry on with their research. So this policy shift, coupled with the government's desire to integrate China into the global economy, foster a really welcoming environment for foreign organizations like the ILSI. So the research funding, because the research funding and resources provided by ILSI aligned really well with the zeitgeist of the post-reform era, which was to attract as much foreign investment as possible and catch up with the West. But much has changed since Xi Jinping took leadership. So under his administration, a new era of geopolitical tensions, often referred to as the new Cold War, has emerged between China and the United States. And this shift has brought heightened protectionism as both nations guard their scientific and technological advancements, viewing them as strategic assets critical to national security. So in China, this has led to stricter regulations on foreign funding and collaborations, as well as new laws targeting NGOs. Under these regulations, foreign organizations are viewed with suspicion as concerns over espionage and national security threats have intensified. The implementations of the 2017 foreign NGO law in particular has made it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for foreign organizations to operate within China. So the book briefly acknowledged some of these changes, and I understand that the research primarily focused on the period before Xi Jinping. Still, I wonder if Susan would agree that ILSI China is actually a product of a really unique historical conjuncture, one that is unlikely to be repeated today. The answer to these questions will likely depend on the extent to which culture, in addition to the state's push for marketizations, globalizations, and scientization, influences the acceptance of industry fundings. So as Greenhalgh wrote in chapter 5, during her time in Beijing, she actually kept hearing the Chinese phrases of 兼容并包, which means all-encompassing, and 求同存异, seeking common ground while preserving difference. So while these ancient wisdoms do contribute to the widespread acceptance of corporate-backed organizations like ILSI, I really appreciate that Greenhalgh does not essentialize this as a uniquely Chinese culture. Instead, she reminds us expressions of scientific dissent tend to be culturally discouraged and politically risky in an authoritarian society. And moreover, under authoritarianism, both the scientific community and industries are subordinate to the state. So it creates a logic whereby as long as the government does not prohibit corporate funding, scientists feel fine to accept financial support from the industry. In other words, in China, receiving industry support is seen not only as normal, but also necessary, and sometimes even as a source of pride, as illustrated by the case of Chen Chunming. Also notable is the observation that China doesn't really have a concept of conflicts of interest regarding research funding. I think it was an observation from one of the expert informants that Susan interviews. This, of course, is closely tied to the concept of guanxi, a network of personal connections or relationships built on mutual favors, trust, and reciprocities. As Greenhalgh brilliantly illustrates, industry actors such as Coca-Cola understand the significance of guanxi in Chinese society and strategically leverage it to establish relationships with key officials and scientists. These relationships seem to work exceptionally well until Margaret Chan, former Director General of the World Health Organization between 2006 and 2017, publicly blamed big soda for rising rates of childhood obesity, and she supported regulations to limit the consumption of sugary drinks. This seems to have caught Mars Spinner by surprise, as Margaret Chan should be within the Guanxi network. So those who grew up or work in Hong Kong would be familiar with Margaret Chan, who served as Director of Health in the Hong Kong government before joining the WHO. In 2006, China enthusiastically endorsed and supported Margaret Chan's candidacies for the WHO top positions. Qin Gang, former Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, said Chan is an excellent and competent leader in international health. I think that was why Mars Spinner wrote that email to Chen Zhongxi, asking for his help and advice in getting Margaret Chan to back off big soda. So this incident, it was really interesting, and it made me wonder if IOSI China's Guanxi network is not maybe as pervasive as it appears, and whether the Chinese government might actually agree with Margaret Chan's view that the big food industry and the global marketing of unhealthy foods and drinks are primarily responsible for the global obesity epidemics. So I would like to hear what Susan thinks about this. Personally, I doubt the Chinese government would support regulatory interventions to restrict the marketing and consumptions of unhealthy foods and drinks, even if it knows that they are a primary culprit of the obesity epidemics. I think this is not only because ILSI wields significant influence over China's health policy, but also because the exponential growth of ultra-processed food in China over the last decade. So according to a recent study in food policy that I found, processed food purchases in China, and also during my observation during fieldwork in China, processed food purchase in China, they are growing at an astounding rate of 50% per year. So over the past decade, China has also developed its own global brands of sugary drinks. Audience here, they may have heard of Tea, for instance, which is a Chinese tea drink chain founded in 2012 in Shenzhen. So it's very similar to Taiwan's bubble tea, but Tea's signature drinks are cheese tea and fruit tea, but both are very high in sugar and made with ultra-processed ingredients. So since it opened its first store in Shenzhen in 2012, Tea has expanded rapidly with 2,350 new stores open in 2023 alone, and not just in China, but also in the UK, Australia, the US, South Korea. In fact, they have just opened a store near my home, and my home is not even in the central part of the town. So Haiti's expansion suggests that China is no longer merely a consumer, but also a producer of sugary drinks, actively shaping this industry on a global scale. So given the massive and continually expanding markets for ultra-processed food and sugary drinks in China, will the government ever regulate the marketing and consumption of these unhealthy products? I personally remain very pessimistic, but would be interested in hearing what Susan thinks. So in conclusion, I think So the Science offers a really compelling case studies and analysis of how corporate influence on public health policy extends beyond borders. So by tracing the rise of ILSI in China, I think Susan did a brilliant job at eliminating the really complex interplay between industry and authoritarian state that continues to shape China's health policy landscape today. So thank you so much for this well-researched book, and I really look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Loretta, for the wonderful discussion and then bringing up the most recent cases of China's globalization of its own sugary drinks. Next, we will have Professor Ayo Wecherberg from University of Copenhagen. He's a professor at Department of Anthropology, working in the field of social studies of biomedicine and on the modernization of traditional herbal medicine in Vietnam and the United Kingdom, reproductive and genetic technologies in China and Denmark, health metrics in clinical trials in global health, as well as chronic living. I'm really interested in what I would have to say about this particular book.
Well, thank you so much, Yi-Chen, and what a privilege to be invited. Thank you so much, Susan, and also great to be together with Loretta as a discussant here. So first of all, congratulations, Susan, are in order. This is such, true to form, I have to say, Susan, such a meticulously researched and documented, anthropological STS piece of work. You really set such a high standard of scholarship, and I think anyone who reads the book will just kind of you see you tell us we need to take this kind of science seriously, and indeed we really see that when we read the book. So I can really encourage people to read really, and a lot of what I'm going to say will be in synergy with what you said, Loretta, as well. So I think there will be a nice discussion afterwards, and I'll really keep it short because I definitely look forward also to the exchanges here. But 2 points basically, and many of them will follow on from Loretta. So the first is how we use STS anthropology, that kind of nexus, to, let's say, typologize or characterize science, as you have, Susan. And the second one will kind of continue this trope of how we then can analyze the travel of science that, Loretta, you also raised. So starting with the typologization, and here I really want to read your work together with a few other inspirations that have been important in my own thinking. So medical historian Jia Chen Fu's work on the history of two yo-yos, work around the development of artemisinin into an effective malaria treatment, and Charis Thompson's work on what she's kind of called ethical choreography in stem cell research. So those of you who know Jia Chen Fu's work, in one of her papers, she makes this distinction between a kind of a tu science and a yang science. So where on the one hand, she kind of depicts, and again, in a similar way as you, Susan, is characterizing tu science as associated with kind of terms like the native, Chinese, local, rustic, crude. It's a vision of science, as she puts it, that's kind of in the service of a socialist revolution in a way. So when I read it, I kind of made the conflation of not barefoot doctors as such, but kind of barefoot scientists. So all those stories, and indeed my own work on reproductive technologies has that element of this pioneering spirit of really doing grassroots science on the ground, and that's then contrasted. Although her argument with artemisinin is that tu and yang come together, but yang science is really what you're describing, Susan. So the kind of foreign, Western, elite, professional, kind of transnational form of science, and the ways in which they kind of mix and mash. So what I found myself thinking while reading, and you show us so clearly these mechanisms of distortion of corruption, indeed, the way in which bias seeps into the science. So as we know, STS kind of initially focused, as you also describe in the introduction, on, let's call it science proper. So going into the labs of biologists, of life scientists, of physicists, chemists, and so forth. and kind of showing that, even there was no such thing as a kind of, uninterested science. There's always forms of interest that are at stake here. And then you show us then, and make a very important case that we need also to take what is described as distorted, corrupt, tainted science seriously. We need to look at its workings because the workings are there. So I started thinking that, given what you describe here, would there be a version of kind of let's say a kind of a true science of obesity that's circulating in other arenas? And this is not an area of research of mine, so I don't have that much insight. But if we went to clinics where obesity is treated, if we went to other settings where the kind of shaping of obesity as a matter of concern in China takes place, that's outside of the very important policy arena that you've so meticulously documented. Would we see other competing theories, so not just the energy balance kind of model, but other kind of sciences of obesity circulating? And what could we think of a Tu and a Yang science at play in this case as well? And then on the kind of bringing Charis Thompson's work on kind of ethical choreography, and very briefly, as many of you will know, she shows how scientists really try to work around these ethical roadblocks that embryos and all kinds of things that brought into the way of doing stem cell research. So that kind of ways of maneuvering around that you're also documenting. And that kind of got me thinking about, the ethical side of, obviously food science is different from working with human subjects, but still, this sense that when is it that, the interruption of science by corporate interests comes to be problematized in Chinese settings. And by coincidence, I was in Hong Kong in 2018 when the He Jiankui scandal around the genetically modified embryos broke. And many of you will know this, but in the end, the kind of analysis that was coming out of China was the problem here was corporate taintedness. And the kind of prestige economies that the form of science that is taking shape in kind of biomedicine, it's really being compromised, at least in kind of the bioethics community in China. That was really the analysis. So there are spaces where the kind of corporate concern is there, but that's, again, it's kind of at the clinic level rather than at this policy level. So again, thinking Tu and Yang and trying to think through that. So that was my first point. Susan, I would love to hear your thoughts on that. And then yes, Loretta, I think you put it very, very nicely, this question of the reception of science or technologies indeed being a passive recipient or not. And here, in recent years, I'm also very inspired by Li Zhang's work on the bentuhua, the idea of culturing work that takes place when foreign, let's put it like that, in her case, kind of psychotherapy forms, when they arrive, so to say, in China, what kinds of processes take place when it comes to be then adapted. And in this kind of twisted way, I have to say, how does this distorted form of science then come to be bentuhuad in China is also what we learn in the second part of the book. So I'm just wondering about what kinds of languages can we continue to develop when we think through the travel of science, which of course has been a trope of STS scholarship for a very long time. Many people, scholars have been, and again, Loretta, you raised this point. So again, the question, I put to the conversation today is, again, I kind of read your book asking myself the question of, okay, there's definitely capitalist craftiness going on. I think you used that term, Susan, in the introduction, for sure, and you really show that meticulously. But speaking with Loretta here, is there a kind of socialist craftiness as well? Is there a way in which there are people gaming the system actively in the kind of Chinese policy? And I'm guessing the answer is definitely yes. Why wouldn't there be? This is the kind of one of the ways in which these things, these mechanisms work, and clearly personal gain, which is very difficult to talk about and indeed document. It seems to me to be such a clear thing to be trying to articulate, because again, returning to He Jiankui, there's no question that prestige, money through these corporate interests, but not just for the research, but indeed for our own bank accounts and so forth. And this, I think, is as universal as it gets. We have examples of this in Denmark, where I work, in the US, as you've shown, in China for sure. So it's just kind of thinking through a kind of socialist craftiness and how that might, help us to further think through these important findings. So let me just close once again by congratulating you, Susan. I mean, this is such an important contribution to STS scholarship on science. We need to take, as you put it, soda science, corporate science seriously in the way that you do. So thank you so much for the read.
Thank you, Ayo. Susan, do you think that we should open the floor to the audience to collect some questions, so then you will respond all of the comments and questions by the end? What do you prefer?
Offer a few quick answers to
Okay.
these phenomenal sets of discussion. Thank you both so much for everything that you said. I won't go on. I'm really very, very gratified. I really can't do your brilliant questions justice here, but just a few comments. One on the level of detail and documentation. Yeah, everybody says that. I'm like, oh. The fact is, I am making gigantic claims against Coca-Cola and against the leading figure in nutritional science and chronic disease policy in China. I felt I needed to document everything really carefully, watertight case for this. So especially like the American scientists who created this, they have this huge narrative about how they're totally ethical and their scientific integrity is intact. And now with this kind of level of documentation of its non-integrity, then they'll have a problem. So that's one quick point. As for a socialist craftiness, I love those questions. I'll have to think about it. I did not study what goes on in the clinic. This wasn't a study of obesity generally. So I only see it through this angle of working with, the global voices on obesity. One would want to work with TCM perhaps and see how obesity is understood. It's probably not FAPE. It's probably not that language. It's totally different TCM language. But what I discovered when I actually talked to a whole bunch of clinicians, but they also were following a Western biomedical mindset. They were very frustrated that their patients did not see that they had a disease. And the Chinese people who were really overweight, unhealthily overweight, also didn't see that they had a disease. So there was a struggle about what is this obesity thing anyway. But much more to think about that there. Loretta had so many questions. Let me see if I can find. Loretta, your point about China's own ultra-processed food industry and how it's coming to shape the global industry. This is really terrifying. This is the big question for me. Who is ever going to protect the health of the people around the world when it is so profitable for these mega transnational companies to be making this junk, marketing it to us? It's so cheap and readily accessible, and it's so darn tasty. Who's protecting our health? Nobody. Governments everywhere are like collaborating with industry. So I fear that what you said, that the Chinese government is unlikely to regulate industry, I fear that that's correct. So who's going to save the health? I mean, now the government, the Ministry of Health, CDC, has long ago asked foreign companies to help implement the health policy that those companies actually helped create. So, who's giving voice to the people? That's a very, very scary question. You're asking questions about ILSI. Oh, what was let's see if I can quickly find it.
The email between, I think, Malaspina, email about Margaret Chan, that was quite surprising to me too, because why wasn't Margaret Chan within this Guanxi network?
Yes, thank you for that. I just love it. And I just happened to find that one email. And so thank you for filling in that piece about the Chinese government being in favor of Margaret Chan. But I wanted to say that what a question, let's see. Oh, industry strategically levering Chinese culture in Guangxi is just terrifying to see how the head of ILSI understood a lot about China, how China works. He went to China in 1978. Coke was the very first company allowed to do business in China. He was on the ground in 1978 looking for scientists that he could collaborate with. He totally wanted to exploit certain aspects of Chinese culture because he knew scientists worked with the state. So he wanted to get to work with some of those scientists so that ILSI could influence policy. Very, very strategic. I cannot find the specific question about ILSI that I was looking for, but I want to say that ILSI in China has now shut down. And the reason is my research, because I've been out there publishing in medical journals saying, look, folks, this is a problem. Look at what's happening in China because of ILSI. And so ILSI in China has shut down. But, so my book I try to bend over backward to be kind and generous to everybody that I talk about. And also especially Chen Chongming and her colleague, Chen Junshi. But the way I wrote it has offended some people in China. There's a Chinese scientist who's very well known for working on obesity, and he wrote these articles saying that the just rapid spread of Western junk food in China is really harming the health of Chinese people. The government should pay attention. And yet, when he read this book, he said, I can't accept it. Chen Chongming, she's a star. She's a Chinese heroine. And what you've written about her is too critical. So he himself is conflicted, and he was going to write reviews of this book for a Chinese audience and a foreign audience. I'm afraid he's not going to now. So it's very difficult to write critically about China because basically this is a tragedy having to do with this collision of Western corporate culture and Chinese government and the Chinese political culture. So let's just leave it there and hear others' questions, but much more to say.
Great. Yeah, thank you for bringing this very lively conversation. Let's open the floor to the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand virtually. If you wants to ask it in person, preferably with your video on. Okay, I already see Lena, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, and thanks so much for the book presentation and also for the excellent comments. I ordered the book, but it hasn't arrived yet, so I couldn't read it yet. But I was trying to link what you were presenting to my own research, more recent research on Chinese, different fields of Chinese high-tech also coming to Europe. And then I struggled a lot personally also with not with this, that you cannot really anonymize the companies you're working on methodologically, and you raised this also right now in the discussion. So I was wondering how you dealt with this methodologically. I think especially when you're a younger scholar, not so well established yet, and it's even more difficult. I mean, even for me, like one company I was writing about asked me to show them my texts prior to publication, and I found a lot of conflicts here. So I was wondering if you have any advice from your personal experience about how to deal with this. And then I was also feeling very interested in, because now we were talking about, Loretta mentioned this first, about knowledge, science coming from the west to the east or to the south. And then I think there are some fields of high tech now where you actually also see it the other way around, where China is leading now and it's coming to other places around the world. And so how this is going to to be? I mean, I think it's probably hard to answer this question, but just one thought that I had. Thank you.
Yeah, so what's the question? What's the second question? And your first question?
I think the second question is, I mean, we haven't done research about this yet, but just it inspired me to think about what happens when we look the other way around as well, from things coming from China and then going, or Chinese corporate activities, like for example of Huawei opening research centers in Europe and then influencing university research. And yeah, so what is happening then when when we look the other way around? But I'm aware that there is still research that needs to be done on that, and probably we cannot answer that question yet.
Thank you so much, Lena. Really good to see you again. That's your research. We look forward to your answer to that question. Big question that we're all left with. So this story that I tell, basically 1993 to 2015 with a look ahead to 2020, Hu Jintao, very, very early Xi Jinping period. So what about now? The situation has changed dramatically. We need to think about, is there anything from this earlier story that we can use to help understand what's unfolding now and might in the future? Methodologically, how to deal with companies. They really did not want to talk to me. In China, there was one scientist who worked for Nestle, and she was basically arm twisted into doing an interview with me. She basically just didn't let us record it. She just basically didn't answer any of the questions. So that's really tough. I've always found that I can learn so much by talking to researchers and scientists, like scientists who engage with industry or engage with the government, with officials, then they can provide insight into those other fora, and then use written materials to try to triangulate to get the answers. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I've just shared the link to purchase the book with a promo code that is generously shared by the University of Chicago Press. So if you're interested, just yeah. Okay, let's see if we have other audience who have questions. Please raise your hand.
Well, while you're waiting for questions, I found one of the points that Loretta made that I could answer while people are coming up with their questions. So I wanted to clarify that ILSI was not registered as an NGO. ILSI was registered as some kind of indefinite entity, but it had the support of so many higher level people in the Ministry of Health that nobody had questions. And so it operated like a think tank, but it wasn't a think tank and definitely wasn't an NGO. So your question, Loretta, is ILSI a product of a unique situation, a particular historical conjuncture where all these things, it's just like post-Tiananmen, the Chinese government wants to go global all of a sudden. And then you've got this scientist who had Western corporate support. All these things came together. So in a way, I think you're right. You asked, is it unique? I don't know if it's unique, but I think that such situations are probably pretty rare. But what's really lovely about this case is I got there in 2013. And so it's like 10 years old, right? And that's not so great. But on the other hand, that's before Xi Jinping really gained so much power, and before this story about Coca-Cola exercise. That story hit in 2015. I was there 2 years before, so it wasn't sensitive. So the scientists I talked to, like 25 of them, they became a little uncomfortable when I was talking about funders in industry, but basically they were willing to answer all my questions. So we had some amazing exchange of ideas. So I feel so fortunate to have been there then, you know.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. I saw that Ellen Oxford, you have raised your hand, but it's not virtually, so I cannot immediately
I'm
capture.
so sorry. I was trying to find the symbol to raise it virtually.
Oh,
and
Ellen.
So I just raised my hand. Thank you so much. It's been just a really illuminating discussion. And I am very, very far from having any knowledge about science technology studies. So I found it fascinating, but I was relating it back to some of our classics in anthropology of food. And I was thinking it would be wonderful to teach this in conjunction with sweetness and power. So I wondered if, Susan, if you would like to relate this to some of that, some of those concerns, and also issues of political economy and globalization and the huge increase in sugar consumption over the centuries. If you had any thoughts on that.
Well, you've been reading Sweetness and Power more recently than I am, but there's just a wonderful set of conversations that can be had there. One thing I try to emphasize in the book is this was a global project, consciously from the beginning, because most people who look at issues like this are public health scholars, and they're just looking at what is happening in Atlanta, where Coke is headquartered. But I want to make the point, and it's not just US, China. It just so happens that China is this fabulous market for the soda industry. And its political culture, as well as its huge market, make it very appealing as a target country. But this is global. The scientific part is global. Coke and its friends in ILSI wanted this science of exercise first to be globally spread and then to be built into policies almost everywhere. So I would love to go, that's an interesting idea, to go back and look in Sweetness and Power, and maybe even write an article about that. Perhaps we could do that together.
It'd be great. Well, I wanted to say the last chapter of Sweetness and Power really also pertains to Loretta's point about the way sugar has invested itself and infested itself into all of this processed food because it's such a wonderful agent for processing and preservation. And also, so that's one of his points, in the last chapter, but also, and this is something maybe I will find, I'm not sure I found it yet because I work more in a rural area, but one thing Min speaks about is as sugar has infested everything and created all of these fast foods and processed food, it's led to the decline of the meal. And thus the decline of the meal because people just grab and go. And that has all kinds of implications as well for social and familial relations. So just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'd love to talk to you more, Ellen, because I'm sort of hanging out in policy and government circles in this book, taking scientists as my informants. But you work with the real people on the ground and even in the rural area. So to bring those together around these issues, which affect health, culture, family, everything, would be really powerful.
Great. Well, thank you again. It's just been so illuminating for me. And as I said, most of the issues you and the discussions have spoken of are just fascinating to me and definitely not an area I know, so even more fascinating.
Okay, let's see if we have other audience with questions. Yeah, I have actually a quite interesting point to add, but I saw that Jiang Jun is already raising her hand, so I will just pass the mic to her.
Hi, Susan. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I also ordered the book and look forward to read the book, especially for teaching on the part on science and technology in China. I have a question, or I'm not sure how to frame phrase that question. I want to go, actually, the question is a little bit related to Ellen's comment. If we backtrack a little bit, so it is not particularly on the policy level, but backtracks a little bit. We are thinking about Coca-Cola arrived in China. China just got out of its planned economy. I remember when I grew up at the China's early reform era, there are very few food options. Coca-Cola is something, I grew up in Guangzhou, so relatively affluent city in China. I have never seen a Coke until high school time, and it was brought back by relatives in Hong Kong, and together with many other junk food. Not that it's a good thing, but I think my point is trying to understand like Chen Chunming's positions, her working with Elsie and looking at exercise, thinking about exercise rather than thinking about dietary control, I mean, she's smart. She clearly is a very smart person, and it's impossible that she didn't know there is a corporate interest in that, as you suggested in your talk. But I wonder whether that kind of opted to work with else and going for suggesting for more exercise has a lot to do with that specific context that China, developing countries, food options very limited. Suddenly you started to see things are coming out, and probably in some way it is not good retrospectively, but at that time it opens a lot of possibilities. It exposed people to experience that they never had before. Suddenly you tell people, no, you actually should not eat that. I feel that seems to be quite something, you know, it's sort of a contradict to, I don't want to say the zeitgeist, but, you know, there is that kind of a sentiment, you know, looking for things, embracing something new. These kind of changes, good or bad in the future, we will know. But at that moment, it's the excitement that comes with reform that brings all these new things and good positive feelings for people. So I wonder whether that kind of historical context actually plays and also a role in thinking about why Chen opted to work with Elsie in that specific period. Thank you.
That's just thank you so much. It's just a wonderful set of questions for sure. All this background is so important, and it's embodied in people's memories. Excuse me, even the memories of all the scientists that I spoke to. Their history of going through the early reform era, and then of course, the excitement of going to McDonald's and drinking this fizzy stuff. And the Chinese government was in love with Coca-Cola from 1975. Coca-Cola was lobbying the government to be allowed to come into China and do business. And the government said yes. The health people were saying, no, this is a bad product for people's health. And the government, many people were saying, from an economic perspective, we could use their technology. We could use their distribution networks. We can learn from Coca-Cola as a company. So Coke was seen at that time as a high-tech, very successful global company. So they wanted it for that reason too. But I agree that there are these memories that are embodied in people's experiences. And Chen lived a very long time. She got her BS way back in 1947. So you can see what she has lived through. On the other hand, she knew that Coca-Cola was a bad product for people's health. And she would lecture the companies that there were Elsie China supporters, asking them to create better quality food for their employees and for Chinese consumers. What I think she didn't know was that the science she was advocating was corporate influence, that the extreme emphasis on exercise was something that was advantageous to big soda. because the scientists who brought it to China, they kept saying exercise and diet, they're both important. But that's just a rhetorical maneuver, because when you look at the actual policy, when you look at talks that they gave in conferences, the lead American scientist, if you look at 50 slides, 49 of them are about exercise, and one of them is about food. So I don't think she realized that exercise was a corporate production, corporate promotion. So I would take her off. But your big point about people's embodied memories is really well taken. Things change rapidly in China, though. But thanks for your comment. So Yichen, you have a question.
Yes, so I think we talked this before in private, but I was also trying to map Cola's role in the kind of mental cultures revolution in China and how people would want more and more instant gratifications that is related not just to sweetness, but probably also to the savoriness in foods, like the spiciness. You know, if you go to China today, I mean, a lot of these tastes that people would enjoy on a daily basis are highly processed and engineered. So it's not just Coca-Cola, but I mean, their marketing campaign and then this cultural washing has actually made a lot of people associate this, you know, what we call junk foods to happiness. That, you know, Coke was in China called happy water, you know, among the folks. So so it's like I think also I think Ellen Oxford has put in a chat box as well that you know, there are actually Chinese version of it, but it's not as successful as the Coke in terms of their marketing, and then in terms of the exact taste that people would fetishize. I remember when I was younger that there is some brands, I think by local people, they call it 非常可乐. It's like very happy. It's called very happy. So it's but it didn't work out. I don't know what happens, but it's yeah, something that I just find very interesting. It's not a real question.
Right. For those who really care about the health consequences of drinking soda, are really up against a powerful force in companies like Coca-Cola. This company has endless amounts of resources, and it really wants to keep dominating the Chinese market. And it is working on every front. I was astonished to learn during the research that Coca-Cola is working with the official Academy of Traditional Chinese Medicine to package TCM in Coke kind of packaging and promote that. So I came away with the feeling that the corporations totally dominate the world in our lives, and we have to somehow stay really strong to figure out how to combat them. But I love your thoughts about cultural change and about engineered taste. Thank you for that.
Susan, just an anecdote. When I was growing up, people actually jokingly say that the Coke is Western herbal tea because of the color that looks so similar to. So people actually like, yeah, I think Yichen makes a really great point about how this, yeah, yearning for this sweetness and spicy food, and people nowadays, when I was in China, they eat it. So I think that was my questions, that it's not just like they simply accept the Coke, they create their own as well and they love it. And how do we like now try to get people off these kind of very highly addictive food is I'm very pessimistic about the future, because the government also benefits from this big food company, those Chinese companies, not just United States companies.
Okay. Yeah, Susan, do you want to have a final remark before we wrap up?
I'm just really really grateful for all of your ideas and suggestions, and I can't wait to sit back and look at all my notes and think about what next. I just, you know, the point that that Io stressed, that we need to take corrupted science seriously very few people are working on that, but it's just as important, if not more important, than mainstream science. So I hope this opens up some, some windows for people to look that way. But thank you, everybody, for all of your suggestions. I'll be in touch with people by email. I think that would work. And thanks, everybody, for coming, and everyone and Yichen for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, for this wonderful sharing, and also for Loretta and Ayo for joining us and give their very thoughtful comments, and for everybody to participate and attentively listen. Please look forward to our next event by Sci-Tech Asia, and follow us on Facebook and other social media channels. Okay, I think we'll just call it today. Thank you all for
so
joining.
much. A real pleasure.
great
Thank
day.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.